The Rolex Cosmograph Daytona is by all accounts a remarkable watch. It is technically nearly irreproachable, incredibly comfortable on the wrist for the long term, and versatile in its suitability to whatever life throws at the wearer, be it in a formal or casual setting, in or out of the water. Possessed of an enviable heritage and long-standing association with motorsport, the other great love of many watch enthusiasts. And of course, the Rolex Coronet in a variety of precious and non-precious metals and dial configurations. There is a Daytona flavor for every lover. The plain Jane steel Daytona has reportedly been hidden behind waitlists in terms of retail availability for decades, and its secondary market value has accordingly been higher than retail for just as long. In terms of raw, naked covetousness, there are few watches for watch enthusiasts that compare. Despite the stellar resume, there are chronographs whose market performance in relative terms surpasses that of the reference 116500. Chronographs from brands considered more or less prestigious than Rolex, and watches whose market prices are both greater than and less than that of the reference 116500. It just goes to show there is value to be found in unexpected places in the world of watches, that things can and do change in terms of taste and desirability over time, and that therefore there is truth buttressing the cliched advice of buying what you like. All the numbers in this video come from WatchCharts.com. Are you looking to browse listings from the biggest private sales marketplaces across the web? See insights on whether you're getting a good deal or not. Manage your collection and track its value over time. You can do all this and more on WatchCharts.com, the world's most powerful watch market research platform. Dive into the data yourself at WatchCharts.com. If we look at the 5-year price history of the Rolex Daytona 116500, just the plain Jane steel without discriminating between the two dial variants, so we're looking at those in aggregate. This watch today has a market price of $28,400. I remember a time when it seemed impossible that it would ever break through what appeared to be more a psychological barrier of $30,000 in value than any reality or reflection of reality in the marketplace. And so now both variants of this watch are sort of settled with a market price of $28,400 in the aggregate. That means that there are transactions happening above $30,000, but the market range extends as far down as just below $26,000. And this watch sort of appreciated in value on a more or less like steady pace up until maybe the middle of 2020. And then the prices started to rise. That's basically the summer of the pandemic. And then speculators perhaps entered the market, more interest arrived in watches, and a whole host of factors conspired to cause the value to start skyrocketing and peaking early last spring, and then since then coming back to a level that is at a more than 2-year low for the price of this watch. Nevertheless, if we look at its performance over the long term, it's important to sort of see that 5-year trend to know that over the last year, it may have lost 14.2% of its value, but it's still up 23.2% over 3 years and over 50% over a 5-year time period. And so what we can do then is see, are there watches that have done even better over the 3-year and the 5-year time horizons? We'll start with a watch that costs $46,700 on the market, an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak. And so yes, this is a somewhat different price point than the steel Daytona, but this watch over the last 3 years has appreciated over 110% in value and over 130% over the last 5 years. So just like over the last 3 years, it's more than 5 times the appreciation of the Daytona. And to some degree, that is because AP is seen as a more prestigious brand, partly because that product is a better product, but also because there are fewer of these watches out there on the market. The tag is a far more interesting example because it costs so little relative to the Daytona. Its market price is only $5,200, and yet it has appreciated over the last year against a backdrop of a market decline. It has appreciated over the last 3 years, and then it's appreciated about the same over the last 5 years, but mostly it's been the last 3 years. My personal hypothesis on this is that this has to do with Max Verstappen starting to dominate Formula One over the last 3 years or so, and so I'm very interested interested in making a video about that sort of further down the line. But over the last 3 years, this watch has beaten in terms of market performance the Rolex Daytona and the overseas as well, even though this particular variant of the overseas with the blue dial hasn't been out for 5 years. Over the last 3 years, it's appreciated 49%, even though it's lost some of that ground over the last year. This certainly is a reflection of the fact that this watch experienced hype, perhaps over that period, but by the time the market corrected a little bit for that hype, this watch had still gained more ground than the Daytona. And of course, the other comparison that I was going to have to do is against Speedmasters. And so in this instance, we're going to look at 3 different Speedmasters, and the performance sort of varies depending on whether you're looking at the 3-year or the 5-year horizon. One, which is probably not a surprise to anyone watching this, is the Silver Snoopy, which has a current market price of $38,500, even though it's lost about the same amount over the last year that as the Daytona has. Over the last 3 years and 5 years, it has just absolutely blown past the Daytona. It's perhaps not a fair comparison because Rolex perhaps made thousands of Daytonas every year, whereas for this particular variant of the Speedmaster, we know there's a very small number out there on the market. Nevertheless, this watch has definitely done better than the steel Daytona. And then the standard 1861 Hesalite Speedmaster, which over the last 3 years has matched the Daytona in terms of appreciation, partly because it barely lost any value over the last year, is barely edged out over the 5-year time horizon, because over the last 5 years, its value has appreciated 49.4% to the Daytona's 52.9%, while it still trades below its last known retail price, which is what I bought it at, which was $5,350 at retail. Its value appreciation has kept pace with the Daytona, which for a watch that is at a considerably lower price point and just not seen in the same category, it's not even an automatic chronograph, for example, is remarkable. And then the third Speedmaster, which is a bit of a surprise to me personally, is the Speedmaster Reduced Reference 351050, which has not appreciated as much as the Daytona over the last 3 years, but over the last 5 years actually beats the 116500. But again, because this watch is at a considerably lower price point, perhaps the appreciation is not as impressive, but in relative terms, it objectively does do better than the Daytona. I recently made a video about the money I've personally lost buying and selling watches and what I learned from the experience. None of the watches I have owned for 3 years or more to date have appreciated in value beyond what I paid for them. So this experience of long-term appreciation of one's watches is still foreign to me. From discussions I've had with other collectors who do have those watches, asking them about how they feel about that question, the response is usually that the value appreciation is just a nice to have if they ever decided to sell. But given that they've held on to the watch for that long, it's unlikely to be anything but a permanent part of that owner's collection for as long as those collections themselves exist. These are not watches that are in those collections with the intention or expectation of being sold at some point ever in the foreseeable future. And even if the watch hadn't appreciated, these collectors would still love the watches themselves. And honestly, collectors with these sorts of watches tend to have a few where they've lost money too. So in the end, do they come out ahead or not really depends on how deep they got into the game and what they ended up deciding to buy. In the end, it's just nice to know that not all the value in the market is only in and around Rolex or the big 3, Rolex, Patek, AP generally, and that over the long term, you never know what might appreciate in value. Thanks for watching.